In this section, I'm going to draw on the work of two figures to make the case that a person cannot fully act hopefully until they have grieved the issue that they're confronting. These figures I'll draw on are Joanna Macy, who is a deep ecologist, Buddhist scholar, and anti-nuclear activist, as well as Francis Weller, a psychotherapist, grief worker, and writer. I'll begin this video by setting some context. I'll first share Francis Weller's 5 gates of grief, which are different openings into experiencing feelings of grief. It helps to understand the many entryways to grief before diving into our discussion. In the remainder and majority of the video, I'm going to examine why it's important to grieve, why we resist grieving and instead engage in denial, and the costs of not grieving. Then, in part 2 of this section, I'll transition to a discussion on how we can begin to grieve and what becomes possible or emerges when we do grieve. Let's begin with Weller's 5 gates of grief. First, he notes that everything we love, we will lose. A part of life is experiencing the death or loss of a friend, family member, lover, pet, house, or what have you, and this is a primary cause of grief. Second, we may grieve because our culture can deem some parts of our personality to be unacceptable or unwelcome, and this prevents full self-expression because we're worried about strong judgment from others. We then have to mask parts of ourselves, and Weller says, quote, "This loss of our integrity and entirety, this inner loss," end quote, is also a cause for grieving. Third, he says, quote, "We grieve the sorrows of the world," end quote, which the news saturates us in, and which we're reminded of daily, these sorrows of the world. Fourth, he says that we grieve the loss of the beauty that we expected in life. This is the loss we feel when expectations of living more beautifully are not met. Finally, ancestral traumas that have not been resolved and which continue to haunt and harm us are the 5th gateway to grief. Weller defines ancestral traumas as, quote, "colonization, slavery, genocide, resource extraction industries, and all the other horrors that have occurred on this continent," end quote. While the first 2 openings into grief are very insightful and important, I consider the last 3 to be most relevant to our discussion. While the first 2 concern grief at an individual level, the last 3 concern grieving over crises and injustices at a global scale, such as ecocide, social inequality, and war. So, why does it matter that we grieve? It matters because we're linked to the world. And by the world, I mean other people, ecosystems, and animals. And we're linked to them through our care, and conversely, through our grief for their suffering. Notice the connections to environmental care ethics. So, if we don't allow ourselves to feel and process this grief over some form of suffering, then we cannot begin to act towards alleviating that suffering. And as we'll see, we can only process our grief if we have a community and support network to help carry us. We cannot do it alone, and trying to do it alone usually leads to ignoring and suppressing those feelings of grief. An initial question to explore is, since it's important to grieve, why is it that so many of us resist these hard feelings of grief, sorrow, and despair around some issue or crisis? Why is it that we resist consciously experiencing and sitting with these difficult emotions? This resistance itself is no small issue. Joanna Macy says, quote, "Of all the dangers we face, from climate chaos to permanent war, none is so great as this deadening of our response," end quote. She suggests that we tend to resist these difficult emotions because they bring a loss of control, and this uncertainty can be uncomfortable. This might be uncertainty over how to respond to climate chaos, for example, or uncertainty around what the future impacts of climate chaos will be. And this uncertainty is understandably nerve-wracking. In part, though, our culture seems especially poorly equipped to handle uncertainty. Science, modern medicine, and technology have brought many benefits, but also have a shadow side. This shadow is that it's led to our culture prioritizing shortcuts, techno-fixes, and other quick and shallow resolutions to deep and complex issues. In other words, we typically enter a sort of solve it and make the problem disappear mode of operating, rather than experiencing the hard emotions that the problem invokes in us. Uncertainty marks our present age. It's a quintessential feature of the times we're living in as multiple crises converge. And this contradicts and upsets values of comfort, certainty, security, control, and always having a plan. Indeed, these are values that many Americans hold on to. And so embracing uncertainty runs counter to our habits, outlooks, and orientations. I mean, if we bravely and honestly open our eyes, then we're living in very challenging times, and they deeply unsettle the habitual ways of moving through the world that we've become accustomed to. Therefore, it's no wonder that we often ignore, bury, and suppress these feelings of despair and grief. And as a quick side point, for the sake of drawing connections, I want to note that boys and men in our culture are not often raised to learn emotional intelligence skills. They're not raised to be aware of their emotions and process them in a healthy way. Instead, it's often the case that showing any sadness makes male identifying people vulnerable to bullying or shaming. Of course, this is the classic example of how patriarchy, as a hierarchical system of male privilege over women's subordination, also hurts men, although not nearly as much as it disadvantages women. However, suppressing these hard feelings of grief and sorrow, which connect us to the suffering in the world, comes at a cost. It exacts a toll. Both Macy and Weller describe how not allowing yourself to grieve leads to a psychic numbing. This is the deadening of our response mentioned before in that line from Macy. It's a closing of the heart where we become numb to how some crisis makes us feel. Basically, this is apathy, the psychological state of not caring. We all know people who are apathetic and likely have felt it ourselves at times. Noticing apathy in ourselves or other people is not a moral judgment, but is just an interesting observation at how easy apathy can be to experience. So, what are these costs to a numb heart? These costs of a psychic and emotional deadening? Well, first, it diverts our energy from positive, constructive, and creative uses, thereby preventing any action towards bringing about the desired changes. Macy says, quote, "The energy expended in pushing down despair is diverted for more crucial uses, depleting the resilience and imagination needed for fresh visions and strategies." And second, a numb heart makes us more likely to be complicit in some moral wrongdoing. A numb heart is more likely to continue supporting some moral wrong. For example, if we become apathetic about climate change, then we're more likely to continue participating in practices that pollute the earth. Weller says, quote, "When the heart is closed and cut off from the living essence of life, we lose a sense of the sacredness of the world," end quote. And this, in turn, allows us to desecrate places. In other words, environmental destruction is only possible if your heart is closed off from the suffering in the world, if you're blocking any hard feelings that the world's suffering causes in you. Seen in this light, one could argue that environmental destruction is a crisis of the human heart. Of course, engaging in denial and refusing to look at the evidence of some crisis only keeps alive the source of despair that we're running from. For example, if we're numb to the evidence of massive social inequality and the damage done to people through, say, poverty-related diseases, because it's simply too sad to consider and we don't wish to feel this sadness, well, this only keeps alive and unquestioned the very social inequality that's causing the sadness we're avoiding. In a nutshell, Weller says, quote, "A numb heart doesn't act to alleviate suffering," end quote. And obviously, by not acting, the source of suffering remains intact. Weller has more thoughts on why we avoid grieving and its costs. He says, quote, "We have this projection onto sorrow and grief as if it is some depressed state, but it only becomes that way because of our avoidance. We become oppressed by the weight of all the unexpressed grief in our lives," end quote. In other words, when we choose to not process feelings of despair and instead become numb to them, The despair actually doesn't go that far away. It sort of lurks beneath the surface. We might think that if we open ourselves to the despair, we'll get lost in it. But what Weller is suggesting here is that since the despair comes from an avoidance of grieving, the only way to resolve these feelings is to process them. It is to let yourself grieve. In this way, Weller understands grieving as a transformative process, and our culture has misunderstood the role of grief. While many of us associate grief with despair, Weller is saying that we feel despair because it's pent up from not grieving. If we do grieve, then we can move through the despair. This concludes section 1.